let me introduce you to our great panelists here. So we'll have Enea Baselgia from ETH Zurich, who will present us his work on taxes on the wealthy in Switzerland. Then we will have Frederik Benhoff from the University of Zurich presenting his work on taxes on capital gains in the US. And then we'll have Marius Ring from University of Texas, working on taxes of the wealthy in Norway. So, yes, so Enea, the floor is yours.
All right, so first of all, let me thank Gabriel and all the other organizers for putting together such a nice conference. I'm really excited to be here. So for the purpose of this conference, I thought that I present to you some work that we did on taxing the super rich in Switzerland, but also show you some of the very new work we do on building distributional national accounts for Switzerland. So the motivation for today's talk is essentially that when it comes to taxing billionaires, Switzerland will play an exceptional role for the simple fact that so many billionaires live in Switzerland. So if you look at the numbers, you see today about 152 billionaires live in Switzerland. In the European Union, we have about 537. So if you put this into the size of the population, you see that really Switzerland is home to Europe's billionaires. So Switzerland features about 1.7 billionaires per 100,000 inhabitants. The European Union has about 0.1 billionaires per 100,000 inhabitants. Moreover, you see that they are on average also a little bit richer than their European Union counterparts, and many of them are indeed foreigners. So about 73% of the billionaires living in Switzerland are foreigners. This begs the question, of course, why are they in Switzerland? Because it might be, at least to some of you, surprising that Switzerland is one of the very few countries in the world that still taxes wealth today. And this, in fact, puts a non-negligible additional tax burden on the very wealthy. And if you look at some of the ongoing work that we do, you see that ordinary taxpayers face roughly similar effective tax rates in Switzerland as they do elsewhere. But there is a tax privilege offered to super rich foreigners called expenditure-based taxation, which is the main focus of today's talk. And this tax privilege can significantly lower effective tax rate for the super rich deciding to move to Switzerland. So I'm going to speak to broadly two strands of the literature. One is on taxing the rich and how this affects their location choice. I'm going to draw here in particular on a paper that I wrote with Isabel Martinez on the super rich in Switzerland. I think the general conclusion here is that institutional contexts matter greatly when you try to estimate migration elasticities as a response to taxation. Second, we build on the seminal work of Gabriel and co-authors and try to build distributional national accounts for Switzerland as well. And here I'm really going to only show you a sneak preview of what is to come in the next year. We're still working on this, and there are still some issues we're trying to figure out, but I think the first results are also quite interesting. So I'm going to talk about mainly about what expenditure-based taxation is, how it works, how sensitive the super rich foreigners are to this tax privilege. Then in the second part of the presentation, I'm going to briefly talk about effective tax rates by income group and how expenditure-based taxation is going to affect effective average tax rates. Okay, let me start with what expenditure-based taxation is. It's a preferential tax scheme that is really designed to attract wealthy foreigners to move to Switzerland and to live in Switzerland. To benefit from this preferential tax treatment, you have to fulfill three main criteria. You have to be a foreigner, you have to be wealthy enough for it to make sense to sign up, and I'm going to be more specific on this in a second, and you're not allowed to earn any labor income within Switzerland. So in practice, this is how it works. Expenditure-based taxpayers pay the same tax rates as everybody else. What is different is their tax base. And their tax base is not going to be their true income and wealth, but rather an estimate of their total annual living expenditures. And for the income tax base, this is just 7 times the owner-occupied rental value, or 7 times your actual rent. And then there are going to be added some expenses for what wealthy people have: yachts, private jets, holiday homes, and so on. There is a list by the Federal Tax Administration that kind of lists items that should be added. In practice, we have no idea how they do it. It seems there might be quite some discretion here between the sub-national level, the cantons that assess this super rich. This is a well-kept secret in Switzerland, and we do not actually know how these expenses are really calculated. What we do know is that at minimum, these taxpayers have to pay 400,000 annual income. So that's the minimum tax base on which they have to pay ordinary tax rates. So if you have below annual income of 400,000 Swiss francs, which is equivalent to about 400,000 US dollar, it doesn't make sense for you to sign up for this preferential tax treatment. For the wealth tax, things are even easier. It's just the multiple of your assessed income tax base, usually a factor of 20 in most cantons. So you're a billionaire, you live in Switzerland, you rent an apartment for 1 million a year, which could be a quite nice apartment even in Zurich, then your income tax base is going to be 7 million. And your wealth tax is going to be 7 times 20, 140 million. And you already can see that you substantially can lower your tax base relative to your true net wealth. So the next thing I'm going to present to you is how the super rich react to the abolition of this preferential tax scheme. And this is a joint paper I wrote with Isabel Martinez, because as you might guess, there has been quite some controversy around this preferential tax scheme, not only outside Switzerland, but also inside Switzerland. So several places took this policy to the ballots, and people were able to vote on this. So all the colored cantons, which are the Swiss states, voted on whether to keep this tax practice or not. And the blue ones voted in favor to keep it, whereas the red ones voted in favor to abolish. And most importantly, the canton in Zurich in 2010 voted in favor of abolishing this practice. So what we do in this paper is essentially we exploit this policy variation to study how this affects the location choices of the super rich in Switzerland. And because this is something that we would like to study with admin data, but there is kind of a big secret around this policy, we have to resort to an alternative data source, which is rich list data, and we describe this rich list data for Switzerland in detail in a separate paper. The only thing that we use here is really the head count of super rich in a certain canton at a certain point in time, and we distinguish whether these super rich are in fact Swiss-born or foreign-born, because only the foreign-borns are actually affected by the policy. And so what we do is a relatively standard diff-in-diff design where we just regress the log number of super rich on a treatment indicator that shows you whether a canton abolished this practice or not. We also add a bunch of controls, and quite importantly in the empirical setting here is that we introduce a treatment group linear trend, which you will see in a second really matters for the empirical estimates that we have in the paper. So let me briefly talk a bit about identification even in this conference. So what you need for diff-in-diff essentially to work is parallel pretrends. And here I first show you just a descriptive which gives the number of foreign-born super rich in treated cantons, which are the black dots, relative to control cantons for the foreign-born. And you see parallel trends roughly hold in the pre-treatment period. On the other hand, for the Swiss-born super rich, things look different. There seems to be a clear violation of the pre-trend assumption, and we're gonna correct for this by using this linear pre-trends. The second concern you might have is that people just move from a treated to control canton after the abolition of this policy. However, what we see in the data is actually very few moves of superage from treated to control cantons, and we have a separate identification approach that relaxes the Sutwa assumption and generates essentially identical results. So I'm not gonna go into this into more detail here. Let me just show you the main estimates that we have here from a static specification first. So abolishing the practice of expenditure-based taxation reduces the stock of super-rich foreigners and Swiss-born super-rich by about 30% if you only have canton and yearly fixed effects. But importantly, once you control for these linear trends, you do not find any effect anymore for the Swiss-born, which makes sense because they were not all affected by the policy change. However, for the foreign-born super-rich, you see a quite dramatic increase of about 43%. And this is very robust to a bunch of things. We had a lot of control, and the point estimates really don't change at all. You see this in the specifications 2 to 6. So this beta coefficient, because it's a large change, roughly translates to a reduction in the stock of super-rich foreigners of 43%. Okay, I can also show you this difference in difference result in an event study specification, where you essentially see that, again, the parallel trends assumption seems to be largely fulfilled. What you also see that there is only a relatively little effect upon instance, and we dive into a bit of more on mechanisms in the paper and show that the effect is particularly driven by people that move to Switzerland are not moving anymore to cantons that abolish this practice rather than by outmove. So it's really inflows to Switzerland that these super-rich that still move to Switzerland don't reside in the cantons that abolish this practice. We can also do more, and here I show you kind of a triple dynamic difference in difference estimator, where we also leverage the fact that Swiss-borns are not treated, and we take here an additional level of difference, and the results are robust. We do a lot more in the paper. I think I'm gonna skip this in the interest of time and talk a little bit about the effect size here. So what we try to do in the paper is kind of back out the implied migration, wealth, and income tax elasticities. This turns out to be not as straightforward as you might think, because what we miss in the Swiss setting is the change in effective tax rate. So usually this is something that you readily observe from a tax reform. It's just the change in taxes. But here what changes is the tax base. And we do not know how large the tax base was under expenditure-based taxation, so we can't really compute the effective tax rate prior to the reform. So what we do is a kind of back of the envelope calculation in the paper, and I summarize this in this figure. So if you look at the top of this table, you see the foreign-born super-rich in our data in 2008. And so we look at 4 different types. The poorest super-rich had net wealth of 150 million. The richest super-rich had net wealth of 35.5 billion in 2008. We then compute the ordinary tax rates that these types of super-rich would have faced in Switzerland in 2008, which is the 4th row. And you show they would have paid around 1.4 to 1.44% in taxes. So that's the total tax bill divided by their net wealth. And then we use some statistics that we could gather from the cantons on the tax payments under expenditure-based taxation. And we Pareto interpolate these tax payments, and essentially what we are able to get is an estimate of the tax payments of these people. So if you only look at the 4th column, you see that the highest tax payment made in 2008 for an expenditure-based taxpayer was 23.9 million Swiss francs. And this corresponds only to about 0.07% in net wealth So the tax change that these people receive is really massive. So it's a change from 1.44 to about 0.07. Okay, and if you use these numbers, you get an elasticity of about 1.5. Let me highlight that our estimates are large, but they're in the range of what the literature has found, but rather on the upper end. Let me also stress that this is larger what Arun and co-authors have found for the non-dom taxpayers in the UK, and we believe this makes actually sense because non-dom taxpayers in the UK seem to be stronger attached to the country given they're allowed to work, whereas in Switzerland, expenditure-based taxpayers are really in the country for this special tax treatment. They're not allowed to work, so we believe that here the institutional context matters greatly. All right, so I have 5 minutes left, and I like to spend the last 5 minutes on showing you some very ongoing research on distributional national accounts, which I have with Remo Gurtner, Julian Kohler, who is also here, and Isabel Martinez. Gabriel asked me whether I will be able to also show something on effective tax rates, so I'm happy to show at least some evidence on this. I'm not going to go into methods and data that we use here, but just give you a preview of some findings, and looking forward to have a discussion later on. So what I show you here is essentially the effective average tax rate across the income distribution in Switzerland for the year 2005. And you see that basically everybody is paying the macro tax rate except for the top 0.01%, which has a significantly lower tax rate than everybody else. And I think this is very consistent with what other people in the literature have found and what you have seen here today already. Let me stress, however, that for Switzerland, this finding is not robust in the sense that it really matters which year you pick. So let me show you 2010. In 2010, it looks like more like a flat tax along the income distribution. And the reason why this happened is that Switzerland has, in the national accounts aggregates, extremely low retained earnings. And these retained earnings fluctuate over time and they become even smaller. And we believe there is to be an issue in the national accounts data. There's going to be a revision in September when they change how they compute dividends. And we think that after 2010, the national accounts data will substantially change. So these results might also change in the next couple of months. But prior to 2010, the data seems to be more robust. So I think in the end, results will more resemble this figure. Okay, what we also can do is split this by different tax types as other papers have done, and the picture is really similar. At the bottom, you have the importance of the VAT, and in Switzerland particularly of great importance are mandatory health insurances, which matter at the bottom of the distribution, and again at the top of the distribution, you have the corporate income tax that is really important. Let me show you the last figure, which is coming back to expenditure-based taxation for the year 2005. So again, you have kind of this flat tax and then the regressivity at the very top for ordinary taxpayers, and then you have two additional data points for expenditure-based taxpayers, which lowers their average effective tax rates even further by about 10 percentage points. And what happens is that these taxpayers essentially do not pay or almost do not pay any income and wealth taxes, and the only tax they still pay is the corporate income tax. Okay, with that, let me conclude by saying that super rich foreigners love Switzerland, not only because it's beautiful, but in particular also because of expenditure-based taxation, which can significantly reduce their effective tax rates. We have shown that the super rich do in fact rate quite sensitive to this policy, and I also have done some kind of back of the envelope calculation on how a global minimum tax on centimillionaires would generate additional revenue for Switzerland, and I'm looking forward to use the newly available calculator and see whether we got estimates that are close to the other. The argument here is just there are so many billionaires in Switzerland. If there is a global minimum tax, where should they go? So this, in the end, could be quite a big increase in tax revenue for Switzerland if this policy would be enacted at a global level. So nothing to fear for Switzerland. With that, thanks.
So we'll have a round of 5 minutes of questions now. So we'll take questions at the end of each presentation. So Enea, if you can stay. So are there any questions? Yes? Lucy, maybe?
Thank you. I may have missed this, but I was just wondering, have you formally checked that or tested the possibility so people are, I understood you think people are not moving out of Switzerland. They're just moving, they're shifting around within Switzerland. I just wanted to clarify that. And then my second question is sort of more vague or policy related, which is do you have a sense of, if this were to be abolished in every canton in Switzerland, where internationally, like what other countries is Switzerland competing with for the supply of, internationally mobile billionaires? And is this regime so much more generous than their second best options? Or maybe you don't know about countries that aren't Switzerland, but I'm sort of interested in the tax competition question of how this policy might be set compared to other countries.
Well, thanks. That's a tough one. So for the first, yes, super rich people leave Switzerland after the abolition too. The argument was mainly that very few just switch from a control to a treatment canton. No, from a treatment to a control. So suit valuations are really not an issue for identification. As for with whom Switzerland is competing, well, just look where the billionaires live. I think this is the best indication for with whom Switzerland is competing. I guess in more recent years we see that places like the Emirates are becoming increasingly attractive for these kind of people. Yeah. I guess that these are the countries with whom Switzerland is now competing for these people, but yeah, I haven't any particular insights about this.
Hi, I suppose I'm not sure if this hasn't been answered by your question, but I know that there have been studies about the behavioral responses within Switzerland because of the significant differences between cantons in terms of for starters, the rate of the tax. But are there any studies that you know of that specifically focus on Swiss nationals leaving Switzerland to avoid the tax altogether?
Well, so there is great research by Marius Brillhardt on co-authors on the effects of taxing wealth in Switzerland across cantons, and what they find is very large elasticities, and this is not surprising, right? In Switzerland, you can move from one canton to another canton at very little cost, and perhaps even easier, you just can shift your income and wealth from one canton to another canton if you have real estate in two of these cantons. So it's perhaps not surprising that these estimates are relatively large relative to other estimates in the literature. I do not know of any research that studies, except for our paper, that sheds a little bit light on this, whether people leave Switzerland in response to taxation.
I have a question with reference to inheritance and estate tax. Giuseppe Marino from University of Milan. For the non-Swiss billionaires, what about the inheritance taxes in Switzerland? Is still expenditure-based taxation applied, or there's another computation?
This is a good question to which I have no answer. I don't think that expenditure-based taxation applies, but to be honest, I'm not 100% sure. Let me just say that there is no inheritance tax on direct descendants in Switzerland anymore. So this should be of second-order concern.
Hi, Carmen Durer from UTax. I was wondering, and I don't know if my reading is correct, but the wealth tax seems to be a bit more capable at capturing some wealth at the top than in other countries. How does it work with, for example, business exemptions, or what is the tax base of the wealth tax in Switzerland compared to other countries?
So the wealth tax base is very comprehensive. Basically everything with the exception of pension wealth. The big issue is that privately owned businesses are heavily undervalued in Swiss wealth tax data. Also real estate in some places are only valued about 50% to its market value. Then tax rates differ quite substantially across Switzerland, from the highest cantons of about 1% to the lowest cantons of only about 0.1%. And also different to many countries, the kind of not only the very wealthy pay the wealth tax, but in certain cantons you start paying the wealth tax with about 100,000 US dollars. So it's about a third of the Swiss population paying the wealth tax.
Hello, I just have a curiosity about the rich list that you use in Switzerland and the location decisions. Having looked at it a bit cursorily for French dynasties, it looks like there's a possibility that some parts of a dynasty are still in France, especially those who are still running the business, and those that are part of a family but not running the business anymore are in Switzerland. And I was wondering if you have the ability to distinguish within the family who is in one other country and who is not.
The short answer is no, because I mean, the Swiss rich list is better in the sense, I guess, than the French rich list, that usually if they include a family, it's not like a family including like up to 100 people. It's like 3 to 5 people maybe. So we know for some Swiss families who actually is included from the tax that they provide. So about half of the entries on the Swiss rich list are family entries, and about half are really individuals. But usually you don't know how many people they include. If they include a family, how many kind of what's the wealth that they sum across. So, and we of course do not know. I think what is interesting is also we do not know per se whether they really are liable for taxation in Switzerland or in France if they own a house in Geneva and also own property in France. I think it's hard for tax authorities here and in Switzerland to distinguish their primary tax residence, and for rich lists it's also quite hard to find out, and I think there is some negotiation also going on.
Okay, thank you. So now we have Frederik.
Okay. Oh, that was the wrong key. Sorry, I'll just lock the screen instead of. I wanted to.
Where is Mathilde?
Okay, thanks. Okay, fantastic. Thank you for having me here. There's something. It's a little bit different because different than my predecessing speakers. I'm not really using data. We're doing simulations. So the disclaimer is all the figures that you see in this presentation, they're simulated. Okay. This is joint work with Florian Scheuer from University of Zurich, and our project is called Capital Gains Taxation and Life and Death. And we study how realization-based capital gains taxation affects household decisions, that is portfolio decision, consumption decision, bequest decision over the life cycle. And particularly we focus on the treatment of unrealized capital gains at death. Lucy already told you about the step up in basis provision, which is great, so I don't have to elaborate quite as much, but under current US law, unrealized capital gains escape taxation at death. That means the heirs will only pay capital gains tax accrued on gains after the inheritance. And this creates a very strong incentive to defer realization and bequeath appreciated assets. And it causes a well-documented lock-in effect of assets over the life cycle. So now we build a tractable life cycle model to analyze these incentives and to evaluate some reform proposals. One reform proposal is basis carryover, which is, under a basis carryover, the bequest case is not treated any different from any other period in life of an economic agent. Under constructive realization at death, this simply means that all the accrued capital gains at the time of the bequest have to be taxed at the time of the bequest. So the heir has to pay a lump sum. Our model incorporates heterogeneity in asset returns, market participation, and intergenerational wealth transfer. It's all calibrated to the US data. And we quantify how the current rules disproportionately benefit high-income households. And we're able to explore some distributional and revenue implications of switching away from the current regime. Good. To do so, we use a new class of models, which I summarize now. We call it the tax portfolio model. And it rests on the fundamental insight that even if you have two assets that have the same price today and the same return distribution going forward, they might be heterogeneous to you as an investor, depending on how much total return you've already earned on the assets. So imagine an investor holding asset A and B, satisfying exactly these properties, and making a decision which of these two assets to sell. So the investor will base their decision on which asset they have to pay more taxes when selling them, right? Which is equivalent to looking at which asset has had the higher total return since acquisition. Now we can leverage this heterogeneity due to historical total asset returns in the portfolio. And together with the current price, we can determine a bunch of quantities that we want to know about assets. So we can take the total return, we can take the current price, and we can recover things like the asset basis, the capital gain, the deferred tax load. So that's just tau times the capital gain, which is to be paid upon realization. And we even get something like a law of motion out of it. So the price tomorrow is simply the price today times big R, where big R is a period return. The return tomorrow, R prime, is simply little r times the period return big R. So now the idea is we summarize a portfolio in a new, say, mathematical object by a function W of R, where W of R is the market value of all assets owned by the investor which have had a total return little r since acquisition. And this turns out to be a more tractable way of keeping track of a portfolio over time than the more standard way of writing it as like a vector of prices, quantities, and tax bases. Now, taking this as point of departure, some other model primitives are that households have access to a continuum of assets, and there's no aggregate risk, so they, at all points in time, they're perfectly diversified. However, there is cross-sectional dispersion in assets. So even though they have this like very, very small exposition to individual asset risk, so you can think of that being zero, still two assets in the portfolio will have different returns at any given point in time. The household then takes their portfolio, little w, as a state variable and carries it through time. They invest into it and they liquidate parts of it. And we can operationalize this portfolio, little w. We can recover some important quantities from it. We can get back the market value. We can get the deferred capital gains tax. We can recover the liquidation value, which is the difference of the two. And we can allow the household to manipulate it and use operations on it. So the household may liquidate parts of it. We preclude short selling. The household also may invest in it. And putting all of these things together, there will be a law of motion. So this W prime on the left-hand side here is the next period portfolio, which is a function of the investments made into the portfolio, the liquidations taken out of the portfolio, and the original portfolio. Now, the interesting bit is this law of motion changes exactly if the household dies and if we have a step-up or constructive realization regime in place. And then we can use that to generate nice figures like this one. So this is not data, again. For example, see the dashed line here? This is the life cycle behavior, savings behavior of a household within the top 1%. A household who will accumulate total net asset value in their portfolio until the very end of the life cycle, when passing on the portfolio to the next generation, who will then save. Here, the dashed line, this is the market value of the portfolio the household holds at any given age. The dotted line right underneath, that's the post-tax value, that's the liquidation value. So the difference between the two, which we can simulate here, that's the deferred capital gains taxes. And you can see the deferred capital gains taxes, the difference is going to increase over the life cycle because households will trade the assets optimally under the hood. So they will not liquidate any assets that have had great runs and very high total returns. They will rather liquidate assets that have been losing. And then at the very end of the life cycle, under the basis step up, this household profits from a huge tax forgiveness. So you see this discontinuous increase in the after-tax value, simply because the taxes are forgiven on the household portfolio. That's for the next generation. And in lockstep, the red curve is the aggregate gains in the portfolio, and you see that the share of aggregate gains as a fraction of total portfolio value is also increasing over time because of this trading behavior of the household. Now, Underneath it all, there is, of course, a household objective. And the household objective is, well, let's tackle it with a sequence of actions and just clarify the timing first. So a household comes in with a portfolio at the beginning of a period, receives some income, exogenously given, makes some liquidation and investment decisions, receives flow utility from consumption, so whatever is not invested, whatever money they've left lying around at the end of the period will be consumed. Then the portfolio earns returns, and the law of motion applies. And the law of it might be a different law of motion that applies depending on whether we're within the life cycle or at the very end of the life cycle. Then we start anew. So in a more mathematical way of writing it down, this looks very much like a standard consumption savings problem, with a minor complication, which turns out to be quite grave. The state variable is very high dimensional because it's a function, the W, and the control variable, the W tilde, that's the liquidation portfolio, is also a very high dimensional state variable. And therefore, we cannot solve this class of model in with aggregate uncertainty, but we can solve it for a finite life cycle, making use of a theoretical result, which is that optimal liquidations take a certain threshold form. Households will always liquidate losing assets first and keep the winning assets until the very end. Good. Now let's beef it up a little bit and put it together as a proper life cycle model. We're trying to stay close to the literature of life cycle models which generate endogenous bequest distributions, but with a key extension of that these bequests are portfolios and are therefore much more complex than just a simple number. Also in our model, we assume there's no population growth. Households live until the age of 80. If they die before, then that's accidental to the household, so that's unanticipated. Time corresponds to 5-year periods, and there's 2 generations. So the first generation starts at age 30, dies at age 80. Second generation, same thing. The first generation receives an endowment at the very beginning. The second generation receives an inheritance. Endowments and income, that's both exogenous to us, and we choose quantities to reflect the joint distribution of wealth and income in the US. We also try to capture a certain mean reversion between generations, so which is also informed by US data. So if you have a very lucky income draw in the first generation, then second generation you will not be quite as lucky. Here are some, on the left-hand side, some plots of the labor income profiles that we're using. On the right-hand side is a joint plot of endowment and age 30 income. So on the left you see this, the dotted line in the middle that just tells you where the second generation starts. On the right, these are the individual households we're simulating along the income distribution. The rest of it is relatively standard. There's just 2 parameters that I'd like to highlight. One is the annual return, E of R. So we assume a 3% annual return on household portfolios on the aggregate. And sigma, which is the cross-sectional dispersion across assets in the portfolio, or more precisely, it's the cross-sectional dispersion that sits in the law of motion. And we choose that parameter, we calibrate it in order to match the capital gains share in bequests to a number of roughly 0.57. So there's a bit of a leap of faith here because it's It's a Norwegian number, so Lucy calculated this one in her paper. And we, strictly speaking, we want to make statements about the US, but yeah, be that as it may. And we can generate quite some interesting results using the framework. Starting up with life cycle profiles, you've already seen this one. What would happen if we change the end of life provision from step up in basis to carryover? Well, there's a mechanical effect that you might expect on the dotted line. You know, this is not going to be discontinuous here anymore, but really what is going to happen to the dashed line up there, because that's a behavioral response in the very long run by the household, and it's small. So for reasonable parameter values that we've used to calculate these simulations, the behavioral response was always very small. I'm going back and forth between these two slides. And the reason for that is there's an income effect and a substitution effect that are working against each other, right? When we repeal the step up in basis, we make bequests more expensive. On the other hand, so mechanically households will have to bequeath more market value to the next generation. On the other hand, they will smooth also some of the next generation consumption into their own life cycle. Right, looking at the bottom 80%, there's really not that much that we can see, because these guys, if they don't die early, they just save entirely until the end of their life cycle. And so they wouldn't be quite as affected by a change in policy. We can also simulate tax revenues, maybe starting first with a more distributional question. We expressing average tax payments made over the life cycle as a fraction of average wealth held by the household. We see that the step-up system is strongly regressive. So the very richest households, everyone beyond the 90th percentile, even more so past the 97th percentile, will pay significantly less tax as a fraction of their average wealth. And this effect goes away completely if you switch to carryover. Plus, a reform would trigger an almost mechanical increase in revenue of about 59%. Now, this is a reform from step up to constructive realization instead of carryover, because it's a bit lighter on the assumptions we have to make on the second generation, but carryover would be in the same ballpark. Unsurprisingly, the change in the bequest size is rather small. Really, the only ones in our model who were responding to this regime change are the middle class households, whereas the richest households and the poorest households quite mechanically do not really adjust the bequest size from switching from step up to a carryover system. And finally, we can make statements about the lock-in effect. An asset is locked in. One says an asset is locked in if you have an investment opportunity that gives you a higher return going forward, but you still don't liquidate this asset because you would have to pay capital gains taxes on the asset today rather than tomorrow. And we can look at this effect in our life cycle framework as well. So look at the very last period of life and offer our households two strategies. One, either to keep the portfolio invested at the given expected return and liquidate everything tomorrow for consumption. B, liquidate the portfolio today and invest at return X. And then we solve for the return X at which the households will be indifferent between the two opportunities. In carryover, this is a pretty straightforward equation. On the left-hand side, you see the entire post-tax value to the household tomorrow. On the right-hand side, you see the compounded post-tax value today minus capital taxes tomorrow. If under step up, things are quite a bit different because you get this big extra gain from not having to pay any capital gains tax if you hold the portfolio just about one period longer. And this causes massive lock-in effects. One would have to offer about 20% or more one period returns to convince anyone of taking the trade under a step-up in basis system, while for the carryover system, you would have to offer maybe 1 percentage point more than the market return. Good. This is as far as I wanted to get. So in our quantitative model, we document the regressive character of step-up in basis as an end-of-life provision. The richest households are able to save about 1/3 of taxes relative to their wealth over 2 generations. We show that liquidation and investment profiles are largely insensitive to end-of-life provisions, and that abolishing step-up reduces bequests for the middle class, but not so much for the very richest households in the economy, because of a substitution and wealth effect. Lastly, abolishing step-up greatly reduces the lock-in effect later in life. We also find that tax elasticities are relatively large in our model, but smaller than 1, and switching to carryover throughout the bank reduces tax elasticities over the life cycle. Great, thank you. This is the end of my presentation. I'll take some questions.
Okay, we'll take some questions if you have questions. Yes, Gabriel. Gabriel has a question.
Thanks a lot. That was great. Thanks. Very interesting paper. I was wondering about the choice to study these questions in a life cycle model as opposed to a dynastic model, in the sense that if the focus is really on super rich individuals, like billionaires, to be concrete, it's not clear that even the second generation is going to consume a meaningful fraction of, the $1 billion in wealth. And that's typically the type of individuals for whom the standard, Barrow, Baker, or dynastic model makes a lot of sense. And so I was wondering whether you had tried to investigate those questions in this type of framework. And my second question is, what about a third? You've not talked about a third option to deal with these issues, which is taxing unrealized capital gains on an annual basis. Have you looked at that? And what are the properties of this type of taxation in your framework?
Yes, I'm going to take the questions one by one. So the nature of the framework limits us somewhat in how many generations we can encapsulate. So it is possible to make it a bit longer at the expense of more computational time and effort. And I'm not quite sure how different the results would be, because most of the computations we make for tax elasticities, lock-in, etc., that all pertains more or less to the first generation. So I think putting a third generation behind the model to make it more dynastic in some sense, we've done that, and it didn't change the results or dynamics of the model quite a lot, because the behavior of the first generation was relatively insensitive to it. The second question is something we have not actively looked into, so that's taxing capital gains at the time of accrual. It would reduce the model to a much simpler version of a consumption and savings model. So I agree that it will probably be a useful baseline to compare against. In that case, everything becomes computationally a lot easier, but also that it's basically the case of the life cycle models that are already out there in the literature. Yeah.
Any other questions? Or? Yes, Lucy.
I wonder if you've thought about different bequest motives. It's like a little bit unfair because nobody really knows what the bequest motive is, but given that your paper is theoretical, it seems like quite important. My understanding is you're assuming pure altruism, but obviously it could be more complicated, and I think that would very directly affect your results.
Yes, so we're using pure altruism parameter of 1, so it would be very simple to change that. It would also be possible to come up with some kind of warm glow bequest motive. The problem is if you want to motivate alternative bequest motives and alternative continuation utility, you would want to take into account the structure of the portfolio that you're passing on to the next generation, which is why the dynastic approach or the multiple generation approach seemed most natural to us.